Begin to transform your life and work towards inner peace with expert psychotherapy. At True Heights Treatment, our experienced therapists provide personalized, compassionate care to help you overcome life's challenges and reach your goals. Whether you're struggling with depression, anxiety, relationship issues, or other mental health concerns, our team is here to support you. With a warm and welcoming in-person and virtual office atmosphere and a commitment to person-centered and evidence-based treatments, we are dedicated to helping you address your life's challenges. Contact us now to schedule your first session at 708-248-7039 or online at trueheightstx.com. Book your appointment today and start your journey towards a happier, healthier life.
The George Brassey podcast is made possible with funding provided from Brassey Global Strategies, LLC, a leading political consulting, public policy, government affairs, and research firm. Are you interested in running for elected office? Need advice? Call or email George, 708-769-5015. Brassey Global Strategies 1 at gmail.com.
Hey everybody, this is George. I'm so glad to welcome Mike Byrne to the podcast. Mike is the man behind the private Facebook group with 12.6 thousand members, the Chicago Outfit, old and current news and articles. Mike, thanks for coming on my podcast.
Thanks, George. Thanks for having me.
Mike, tell the audience a little bit about who you are, and then we'll get into the group that you've created.
Okay, well, basically, I'm a huge fan of music, and I've played in bands for the last 30 years of my life, like on and off. And one of my main hobbies or like passions was studying and researching the Chicago mob. Growing up, I grew up in the western suburbs of Chicago, and I've lived in the city now for about 20 years. But growing up in the outskirts of Chicago, I was always like hearing stories about like mob stuff on the news. When I was a kid, I would always turn to TV. We'd always watch the news in my family during dinner time. And I remember always seeing like, when indictments would come down and mobsters would come on the TV. And so it just kind of fueled my passion for it to like study about it more. And just kind of, it turned into like almost a 15 to 20 year passion of like reading and doing research on the individuals connected to the outfit.
What suburb do you grow up in, Mike?
I grew up in Naperville, which is about like maybe I think like 35 miles west of downtown Chicago.
Sure. Got it. And Mike, talk about the Facebook group and what inspired you to create that.
Okay, well, what happened was I had some health issues that kept me out of work for a couple of years. I needed surgery in my legs, so I had a lot of time in my hands, and I came across this group on Facebook about the Chicago mob. It was just a guy who had a group and just said like, hey, post, anyone has any questions, post. So I came across on the Chicago Tribune website that for a while you could access their archives and for free. So I started going and pulling all these old articles up from their website, and I posted them in this group. But then like on the first day I did this, I posted maybe like 6 or 7 articles, and I got a message from the guy who ran the group, and he was kind of upset. And he's like, hey, you're kind of hogging the group. You're posting too much. And so I was like, okay, no problem. It's your group, it's your rules. So I just decided, I'm like, you know what, I should just start my own group then. And so I'm like, I was bored one day. This is probably July of 2015 this was in, and I just started the group. I had no idea how to do it. Luckily Facebook, it's fairly easy. It's the start up a group, but I had no ambitions. I'm like, you know what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna post a couple articles from the Tribune, and maybe people will see it and want to join. I mean, I didn't think it would last more than a few days, and so I started doing it, and I started getting, I think, I had maybe 30 to 50 members the first month of doing it. And originally when I did it, I posted like 3 articles a day I would do just for the Tribune, or I'd post like transcripts from courts, anything you could find online, I would post in the group. And I just started getting more members were joining. And before I knew it, I had about 800 members, which was way more than I thought I'd ever have. And then I started getting messages from members of like family members who were like, I would recognize some of the last names of people joining the group. I'm like, oh, that's the same last name as this mobster. And as it turns out, it was their sons and daughters of mobsters, and they would just send me messages. Some of them would send private photos and stuff like that. And I mean, a lot of times they would go, can you please keep this private? Which I always respect. Anyone who doesn't want anything posted in the group, I will not post. So I respect everyone's privacy. And next thing you know, then I started just like more people joined, and probably within the last 2 or 3 years, it exploded then. And like I said, now we're at 12,000 members, and it keeps growing every day. And when I started, the rule I had was I wanted to post articles every day. I didn't want to, because a lot of groups, they go stagnant after a while. Like people just stop posting and nothing happens. So since July of 2015, there hasn't been a day that I've missed that I have not posted an article. So every morning when I get up in the morning, the very first thing I do after walking my dog is I post articles in the morning. And it's just basically now I post anywhere from 5 to sometimes 10 or even 15 articles a day on there now.
Mike, and you're behind all this, and you said you were in bands growing up and for 30 years. Is there a connection? Because I've been in bands before, and you've got to kind of do it yourself, so to speak. Is there a connection in your mind between your Facebook group and kind of your musical background and the scene back in the day?
Oh, for sure, yeah. Because I mean, growing up when I was younger, when I first got into the punk scene and stuff, it was a very like DIY scene. Like a lot of the shows being booked were do-it-yourself shows. The bands, they made their own flyers, they rented their own halls and put their shows on. So I mean, in a way, I kind of use that aspect of that with my group. I'm like, well, I'm just going to start this and do it the way that I want to do it. It's like if I don't. So I mean, in a way, I set a guideline rule when I first started. There's a lot. I mean, Al Capone is an interesting person, and there's a lot of books written about him, but that's just an era of the mob that I really never had much interest in. I more had interest in like the Paul Ricca, Tony Accardo on up years. And a lot of the groups focused on the Al Capone stuff. So I usually focus on from like 1950s on up to the current day. So I tried, but like everything I've done in the group though is everything, but like I kind of took that ethic of which I learned in music and kind of just used it in my group then of doing it myself, promoting it myself. And even, I mean, I have some friends who help out sometimes when like I get busy with stuff, but for the most part, it's been my baby since it started pretty much.
Mike, who are some members of the outfit that you find really interesting and why?
I always found a few of them. A guy by the name of Marco D'Amico, who was he just passed away a few years ago, but he was an interesting figure because he was for a long time he was never in the news. He was just kind of flew under the radar, and he probably generated millions untold millions of dollars with his bookmaking operation. He's probably one of the biggest bookmakers in Chicago, probably for the last couple of decades. And he finally went to prison in the early 90s in Operation Gambat when he got indicted. But he was always kind of an interesting guy just because like he was not your typical mob guy where like a lot of the guys you see, they're old men in dark restaurants meeting. He was kind of guy who was out on Rush Street all the time with his crew drinking. So it's kind of had a party atmosphere to him in a way. So he was always kind of an interesting figure. And then you have guys like obviously the Spilatros were always a well-known name in the Chicago outfit and stuff like that. And he's one of the more popular people that people want articles about since the movie Casino is partially based on his life. And even some of the current guys now, like there's a guy who grew up in my neighborhood by the name of Albie Vina, some say he's the current street boss of the outfit right now, but he was arrested for murder once and was acquitted of the murder, but like the FBI, they named him the most dangerous man in Chicago due to his he's never been convicted of a murder, but they say he's got a long list of people that he's a suspect in many mob murders. And his name pops up in the news every now and then, but he's a really low key figure in the outfit. And even a guy like Jackie Cerrone, who was one of the bosses in the 60s and was an underboss through the 70s and 80s. Like a lot of these guys, there was a lot of articles written about these guys, but there's really not a lot of good books written about these individuals, and I find these people more fascinating because there's not much actually written about these guys. Where a lot of the books more focus on Tony Accardo, Paul Ricca, and Sam Giancana and the bosses. Where like I wish there were, and I try to report on a lot of post articles on a lot of these guys more because there's not much written about these guys in books. So I try to avoid. I mean, I'll post articles on like guys like Tony Accardo and Sam Giancana, but there's so much written about those guys that I try to focus on some of the lesser known guys sometimes.
We couldn't have a conversation about the outfit and not talk about Albert Taco.
Yeah. Yeah, Albert Taco. I'm glad you brought him up because actually he's another guy who's actually a very intriguing guy. He's probably one of the few guys who actually had his own wife testify against him in court. And his trial, he actually fled the country before when he was indicted. He got word, I don't know if from a dirty cop, but he actually went to Greece to hide out, and the FBI used his own 6-year-old son to capture him. The FBI found out that his son was going to meet him for Christmas. So the feds actually got on the plane with his son, and the son had no idea that the feds were with him. And when Albert came to see his son, the feds zeroed in on him, though. But I'm glad you brought him up, though, because he's a very interesting figure to talk about.
What else do you know about him?
A lot of his personal family life I know very little of, but the one interest there was a video. It's no longer online. I've been trying to get a copy of it. In the early 80s, he opened up an Italian beef stand in Chicago Heights, where that was his area. And one of the local news stations decided to post up across the street and film that so they could expose him. Like, hey, there's this mobster who owns this restaurant. So Albert Taco decided to get one of those like Groucho Marx disguises, like the glasses with the fake nose, like the Halloween stuff. And he dressed up in this ridiculous outfit. And the news is filming him while he's making food, and it looks when you first see it, it looks kind of creepy because you can't tell he's wearing a disguise, and you're like, who's that weird looking old guy with like a big nose and glasses? And it was Albert Taco. This guy, he knew he was being filmed. And then another time when he left court, he like was one of the many mobsters who would run out of the Dirksen Federal Building, and he had the camera crew chasing him all through downtown while he was running at a high speed. He must have been in good shape because he took off like a rocket, and he ended up hiding somewhere. They didn't find him though, but I know during his trial though, a lot of stuff came out about murders that he was involved in or he approved and stuff. So his trial though, and he's another guy not much is written about. And he'd be another really interesting person that for someone to write a book about, because I think, Chicago Heights was a real violent crew in the history of Chicago outfit. The chop shops were all down there, and so a lot of murders in the 70s were attributed to the Chicago Heights crew.
And I just want to say that that restaurant is still there.
Is it? Okay, wow.
Enzo's Beef and Caramel Corn Shop, and it's a great member of our city, but I definitely have never heard of that footage that you were talking about, Mike. That's wild.
Yeah, it was CBS 2, because on their old website, they used to have, it was called From the Archives, and so once a week on their website they would post a new video, just anything for Chicago history. It could be a plane crash. And they did one on the Spilatra brothers and then one on Albert Taco. And that's the time I saw the Albert Taco one. And I wish there was some way I could have. I just assumed it would be in their archives, but usually once a month I'll go and try to find it again. And I've never been able to find it ever since then.
Wow. Mike, what is this process like to try to find all these articles and dig up all this stuff from the past? I mean, you're an amateur historian.
Yeah, well, basically the process I go through is the Tribune now, like before it was the archives were free, but the free archives, it just gave you the text of the articles, not the photos. But so I pay a monthly fee. I think it's like $7 or $9 a month I pay. And it gives me complete access to every newspaper the Tribune ever did, from like literally the early 1900s to now. Like, so it's actually kind of a cool thing, because sometimes when I'm bored, I'll just look up like certain dates in history, like the day after we invaded Normandy. Like, it's kind of cool to see what the front page looked like on all these historical days. So it's a really cool feature the Tribune has. So basically what I do is like I usually don't like sometimes when I wake up and I get ready to do the articles, I'll have a few ideas. I'll be like, oh, maybe I should do an article on like Albert Taco, or maybe I'll do one on the chop shops. So a lot of times I just go into it but if I'm like reading a book at work on my break and like I'll come across a name that I haven't really looked up articles on. So I basically, or sometimes people will request like, oh, hey, can you post an article about Don Angelini or Tony Accardo or this and that. So I'll try to post articles if people request them, but usually I'll go into it with a few ideas like, oh, I want to cover the Sam Giancana murder today, or maybe I want to cover like this one. So I kind of have like I got a rough sketch of what I want to do, and then I start looking up the articles. And like usually what I'll do is I'll type a name in, like so it's like a Google search engine, and so you can put in like a Sam Giancana, and it'll pull up every article that mentions Sam Giancana and the date it's on, and then you select which article you want to look at, and then it takes you to that paper. And so that's basically and then what I do is I copy and paste the article, and then I put it in my group then, and then like the Sun Times, they have a pay archive also, but the Sun Times is way more expensive, and it's just text only. You don't get to see the original article with the photos. So the Sun Times, I just every now and then I'll pay for access for it just to spice things up, and because like sometimes I hate reposting the same articles, but with so many new members joining, I have to repost certain articles that they might not have seen. But sometimes, usually with the Sun Times stuff, if I'm looking for like if there's a certain story I want to get both sides of the newspaper, like what the Tribune reported and how the Sun Times reported it, I'll do that. But usually I just stick to the Tribune because it's like I said, it's really cheap. I pay only $7 or $9 a month, where the Sun Times, they for a monthly subscription they want to charge like $99 or something. It's really expensive, the Sun Times. So I usually just stick to the Tribune, or sometimes I'll find a local newspaper like on Google Archives that might have an article. But that's basically how the process goes of finding the articles.
Mike, does the outfit still exist today?
It does. It's a really different version of what it used to be. I mean, a lot, because that's a common question I get asked a lot in the group. And the days of the traditional boss and street bosses, and it's still there, but it's a shrunken down version of it. And I honestly, to this day, there's people still think the FBI think Sal De Laurentiis is the boss, and honestly he's not. Honestly, he's retired. I don't think he wants anything to do with I mean, he spent 16 years in prison. It's like that, and he did his time, kept his mouth shut. And I think today he runs his own business with his daughter. I mean, if he is involved, it has to be on a really minor scale, I imagine. I've heard people say James Andino is a current boss. There's so many rumors going on. I mean, even the FBI, they don't even really know it because they're so low key now that like it's almost now, especially now with Chicago becoming a more violent city with street gangs and so many and also like in post 9/11, that actually took a lot of the FBI off the outfit and onto terrorism stuff. So the outfit really, in a way, is kind of being left alone in a way, because the FBI have so much more to worry about now. But they're still there. But like the old timers now, they're not really hands on anymore. I mean, if the old timers are still involved, it's really on a kind of like a more of as an advisor role probably to the younger guys, because some of the younger guys now who are getting caught for stuff, they're getting caught for they're doing some really dumb things now, like just like making threats on phones, or I mean, and nowadays like more people are flipping to cooperate with the government now, and they don't really kill people anymore, so there's really no threat of so they're not the threat they used to be, basically, but they're still there. I mean, it exists, but just on a really smaller scale.
Mike, one thing that amazed me when I first saw your bio is you you have played in several bands that I'm familiar with, like the Methadones and the Vindictives. Can you talk a little bit about your career as a musician?
Sure, yeah. I started playing guitar when I was in junior high, so probably like 87, 88, I started playing guitar. And when I first started playing, I just played a bunch of garage bands, like just with friends in the neighborhood. Basically, anyone in the neighborhood who had an instrument, we would go to someone's garage and I mean, I was horrible. I mean, we would learn a couple cover songs and try to play them. And we never did any shows, but like once like in high school, then once I started going to more shows and meeting people who with the same musical, the same music we liked. Then I started playing, meeting more people and started bands. So I started a band with a friend of mine. We never recorded, but we played around a lot. It was called the Geeks. I mean, basically we just did a lot of cover songs of bands like the Forgotten Rebels and Angry Samoans, bands, and just basically we would try to play, but we weren't very good. But that's how I already knew the guys in the Vindictives. Just my brother and I used to do a video zine called Out of Focus Video. So we already got to know a lot of bands, local bands, and just from going to shows for years, you end up meeting the people. So like I was already friendly with Joey, Johnny, and the guys in the Vindictives. So Joey took a liking to the band, the Geeks, that I was in with my friends, and he just thought we were a funny, goofy band. So we opened for the Vindictives a few times, and then in August of '94, Joey called me one day and he's like, "Hey, we have some shows coming up," and Dr. Bob, who was their guitar player at the time, was having some issues. He's like, "Can you fill in for a couple shows?" And to me, I mean, the Vindictives, and they're still one of my favorite bands. I mean, I was just out of high school, so I mean, I was like so excited. I'm like, "Wow, how cool is this?" I'm joining one of my favorite bands, but even just for a few shows. And then like a week later, Joey called me back and he's like, "How about, he's like, this thing's not going to work out with Dr. Bob. Do you want to just join the band?" And I was like, wow. I'm like, "Oh, yeah, sure." So like I went and I learned every single song they had, and the leads too, because Dr. Bob was the lead guitar player. So I was already familiar with most of the songs, so it was fairly easy to learn everything. And so I played with those guys for about 2 years. And this is when they were signed to Lookout. So we worked on an album that we were going to release for Lookout, and Joey was having health problems throughout the time I was in the band. So we ended up we played one show, and we wrote a ton of material, but we just never recorded it properly in a studio. Like we did 4-track demos of some of the songs and stuff, but Joey, they were never big on a big live band. Joey and those guys were never big. They didn't want to tour. They wanted to basically be more of a local band and just release records, which was cool. But I mean, I was only 18 at the time, so I mean, I wanted to tour. I wanted to do everything. So around '96, the band just kind of like Joey's health was still kind of shaky. He was, so we decided just to split the band up, so then I just played around for a few more years again, just in different bands, jumping around from band to band. And I ran into Dan Schaefer. This was probably in April of like 2000. He just moved back from DC. He was living out there for a few years. And so him and I started hanging out again, because I've known Dan probably since the early 90s. And
can you for context say who Dan?
Oh, yeah, Dan Schaefer. He he was in Sludgeworth, Screeching Weasel, an old band called Generation Waste. He was in the Riverdales, the Mopes. I mean, he was still is a really well-known guy in the pop punk community and stuff. And Screeching Weasel were always a huge band. I still think they're a great band. Same with I think Sludgeworth is one of the best underrated bands of all time.
Extremely. I agree with you on that.
And I probably met Dan around, I think it was around 92, 93, I met Dan. And so we knew each other for a while. So when around April 2000, I was just playing in just another local band at the time, and Dan moved back home. So we just started talking and hanging out, going to record stores, and he came to see my band play live. We were opening for the Jackie Papers, the guy from the Pink Lincolns band. And the ironic thing is Screeching Weasel was doing a surprise set that night. But that's the version without Dan in the band. So it was kind of weird for Dan to be at the show and here's old bands on stage playing and stuff. So one day Dan's like, he saw us playing. He's like, "Hey," I really liked how you play guitar. He's like, "You want to work on some stuff? Just come over to my house." So Dan and I just started working on songs on a 4-track. And at the time he told me, he's like, "Oh, I'm starting the Methadones back up." because the Methadones were kind of on and off for a couple of years. They would just play locally, and they recorded a 4-song demo and stuff, but never really did a whole lot. And he said he was going to put together a new version of them. And so I told him, I go, hey, if you ever need a guitar player, I'd love to try out. And he's like, oh, well, we already have a guitar player already. So I was like, that's cool. So they played a local show, and it was a little sloppy and stuff like that. And afterwards, Dan told me, he's like, oh, I kind of want to rearrange the lineup. He's like, I want to have you play guitar in the band. And so I joined the band on guitar, and Pete, who was the guitar player at the time, moved to bass. And basically then, so I was basically that, and then that was the lineup of the band at that point then, that started like basically recording, tour. Dan already had the first album recorded already, but by the time I joined and we got going playing live, like that's the band that recorded the records and did everything for the 10 years that we were together then at that point. So that's how the band, I got involved with the Methadones then.
And is the Methadones, are they still playing?
We broke up in 2010. We've done some reunion shows and stuff like that though, but I mean, outside of reunion shows, the band's basically split up.
What's it like to work with a guy like Dan, like in the creative process?
Well, I was, besides being friends with him, but even before I knew Dan, I was a huge fan of all his bands.
Yeah,
and his songwriting. I think he's such an underrated songwriter too. And he added so much to those Screeching Weasel songs. Like, people don't realize, that Screeching Weasel was always Ben's band, but when you hear like My Brain Hurts and that stuff, Dan added a lot to those songs. And so watching Dan write Dan and I lived together for about a couple of years too. So we would, when I would watch him work on a song or write a song, it was interesting to see how he just comes up with it. Like, you could play 3 chords and show it. You go to Dan, hey, play 3 chords to him. He'll turn that into a catchy song. It was amazing how quickly he could just like come up with this stuff. And I'm like, man, and stuff that like would be really catchy, and I would just be blown away. I couldn't believe like how he made it look so easy, but I know it wasn't easy. But he's just a really, really talented guy. He just knows how to write a really good 3-minute pop song.
Mike, why do you think the bands like Screeching Weasel, the Methadones, the Queers, all these great bands, why didn't they get bigger than they did?
I think each band is a case by case thing. I think with Screeching Weasel, the only reason I think they didn't get bigger is they didn't tour enough, because they had the fan base. They were selling a lot of albums, and they were making a living just from record sales. Those guys, they were selling enough albums they could live off the band, but they just weren't a big. Ben, for some reason, Ben wasn't big on touring. He wasn't like, live, once he was on stage, he seemed to enjoy himself, but he was never a big, and that's how it was with the Vindictives. Joey was never big on playing live. He just did, that's the part of the thing he didn't really like. He was like, some guys like different aspects of being in a band. Some like to play live, some like to work in the studio. And I think with Ben and a lot of guys, it was more, I think they just like the actual songwriting process of creating the song and doing it. But I think with Screeching Weasel, I think that what hurt him the most was the lack of touring. Where with the Queers, though, they toured a ton. They really toured. Those guys were always on tour. And I think with the Queers is they could write these amazing, like beautiful pop songs. And then they would have these fast, quick punk, songs like, I Want Cunt, or or Tulu's the Wimp or something, which are fun songs. But I think, just they were, people could hear a song like Deborah Jean by the Queers. And like, my dad one time overheard a song and he was like, who's this band that's playing? I told him, he's like, wow, that's a really catchy song. And I'm like, I know. And I'm like, why, why isn't a song like that not a big hit? And it's just, I think with the Queers, it's just like, maybe the name of the band scared people off. Maybe, if that's the weird thing is like, I think a lot of it just comes down to a crapshoot too. It's like there's two bands can put out amazing records. One will be successful and one will flop, or even like look at Jawbreaker. When they were a band back in the 90s touring, they were popular, but no one would have ever thought they would. Here they are now selling out the House of Blues, so it's like, I mean, which I think is great. It's great that these bands are finally getting the recognition they deserve. But I think in some cases, I think a lot of it has to do with the touring now. Like if you look at a lot of the Fat Record bands, they all toured their asses off. They just toured, put out an album and would just tour all year long. And that's what I think kept those bands going for so long, because, that touring sells records, and then you had the Warped Tour coming in, and so a lot of Lookout bands has never kind of got onto that bandwagon of the Warped Tour and stuff, and like we were never interested in that part of it either. It was like, but like Fat Records, they knew how to market their bands like to that crowd, where Lookout was more just kind of like, they didn't, if a band wanted to do it, fine, but yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to touring, I think. And and distribution, having the record available in stores.
Wow, this is a great stroll down memory lane from because I grew up in the I graduated high school in 2005, so I was in garage bands well after Screeching Weasel was broke up for a decade.
Okay.
But I love the Methadones, and these are all great memories of these bands that you're talking about.
Well, it's the funny thing is like when I first started when I first started seeing a lot of these bands play, the first time I saw Screeching Weasel, I think maybe 80 people were there to see them. I mean, but it was cool to see how fast these bands caught on. Like, I remember I saw Screeching Weasel, like, it was at McGregor's, and I think there was probably maybe 100, 150 people there. And then once My Brain Hurts came out, the next time they played, there was like 400 people there. I mean, they seemed to explode. I mean, it came out of nowhere, Screeching Weasel. Like, they were just, next thing you knew, there was a line around the building to get in. It was like, geez, how did this catch on so fast? Like, and it just seemed like, and then once Green Day in '94, that Dookie came out, it just got even crazier. I mean, even small, like that, like my old band, the Geeks. I mean, we were we weren't a good band, and punk was so popular then that kids didn't even care who was playing. If it was a punk band, they were going to go see it because, if it sounds like Green Day, I'm going to like it, they would think, and something like that, which was cool though, because a lot of smaller bands were getting a chance to play in front of an audience and stuff. But it was cool to see how bands like the Queers, Screeching Weasel, and these bands went from like, maybe playing to a half-filled club to like, next thing you know, they're playing 2 sets a night or 2 nights in a row because the demand's there for it.
Mike, what are 2 books that you'd recommend to the audience that have been important to you as a person?
2 books, I mean, for mob stuff, I think, and as much as I'm not a fan of the author, is there's two books from mob I'll go with. The book is by Bill Romer. He's a retired FBI agent, but he's notorious for kind of making him sound more important. But his first book, called Man Against the Mob, if for anyone who's looking to get like a basic rundown of how the Chicago mob was in the 1950s, 60s, even through the 80s, Man Against the Mob's a good book. It gives a good like blueprint of who the major players were and how the mob works, like how they make their money and stuff. And then I would go with another book I really enjoy is a book called When Corruption Was King by Robert Cooley. He was a former mob lawyer who for years helped fix cases for the mob, and he ended up working with the FBI then to help bring down the First Ward, which at the time was like the mob's power base in Chicago. They controlled everything downtown. So that's another so anyone who wants to see how corrupt Chicago really was and see how the mob controlled politics, When Corruption Was King is a really good book, because it shows you how much control they really had over the city. I mean they could fix any cases that they wanted fixed. They could do it for you. So those are but for music, as much as I'm a fan of punk music, there's not a lot of really good punk books out there that I've read that I'm like, wow, that's but like for fans of music, there's a book called Reputation's a Fragile Thing, which is the history of Cheap Trick. I'm a huge Cheap Trick fan, and that's a really good book. And there's a book called Kiss and Sell, which is about one of the guys who worked for the band Kiss. And it shows you like the financial end of things, how the band worked, how the money came in and how the money went out. And it kind of gives a good background to like seeing how a big touring band like actually works, functions and something like that. And I'll give one recommendation also. Because this combines music and the mob, is the Tommy James book. I believe it's called Me, the mob. I wish I could. Basically, if you Google Tommy James autobiography, it'll pull it up. But Tommy James's record label was owned by a New York mobster, and all his money basically the label stole from him. Then he never got royalties, and he ended up he had to go to hiding at one point because a mob war was breaking out in New York City. And I never knew this about Tommy James until this book. I mean, I had no idea. I knew the label he was on. It was a label called Roulette Records, which was owned by Morris Levy, which he was a New York mob guy. And the character Hesh on The Sopranos is actually based on him. Wow. And that's who the guy from Sopranos. When he wrote the character Hesh, he wrote it about Morris Levy. And basically, Morris Levy he had a record label. What he would do is he would find these young songwriters, and he would pit out the records, but he would pit himself as a songwriter. So anytime the record sold, he would get royalties for songs he had no. I mean, the guy, he didn't know how to write a song. He just put his name on it, and that's how he made his money. And so but that's a really good book just because it talks about the music business, but also how the mob controlled the business side of it and Tommy James's career.
Mike, this has been a pleasure having you on. Where can people connect with you, find you if they want you to play guitar in their band?
Basically, the best way to get a hold of me is probably through Facebook. My Facebook group is the Chicago Outfit Old and Current News Articles. And I mean, basically it's a private group, but anyone who joins, I basically accept everybody. I just do it private just so it avoids people spamming the group, basically. That's why I have it set to private. But if you send an invite, 99.9% of the time, I accept every member who joins the group. And probably Facebook also is an easy way to get a hold of me, is just send me a friend request on Facebook or something.
Mike Byrne, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Cool. Thanks for having me.
Take care.
All right.
Help George stay on the Chicago Heights City Council. Go and donate today at tinyurl.com/AldermanGeorge 2023.
Begin to transform your life and work towards inner peace with expert psychotherapy. At True Heights Treatment, our experienced therapists provide personalized, compassionate care to help you overcome life's challenges and reach your goals. Whether you're struggling with depression, anxiety, relationship issues, or other mental health concerns, our team is here to support you. With a warm and welcoming in-person and virtual office atmosphere and a commitment to person-centered and evidence-based treatments, we are dedicated to helping you address your life's challenges. Contact us now to schedule your first session at 708-248-7039 or online at trueheightstx.com. Book your appointment today and start your journey towards a happier, healthier life.
Need more George? Like his pages on Facebook. Friends of George Brassey PAC, Fifth Ward Business Alliance, Chicago Heights Bicycle and Pedestrian Resource Center, and the George Brassey Podcast.